when you look at the money specifically for the London Stock Exchange, it's cumulatively trillions of dollars, right? They have no way to have any exposure to Bitcoin. So when these Treasury stocks start to pop up, there's obviously immediate interest from these institutions.
I would say one of the biggest fears amongst Bitcoiners is that come the next bear market, these companies, they'll be the first ones to sell.
I'm not saying that I expect there to be some huge black swan event that's going to tank the whole industry, but it's probably sensible for us to put some kind of hedge on. Saylor doesn't need to hedge because he's a multi-billion-dollar company on the NASDAQ and he'll always have access to capital. But for us, a hedging strategy would actually afford me to be able to buy bigger in the bear market. Old dudes who are in finance telling me that Bitcoin's rat poison squared. Jamie Dimon's hated it, and now he's adopting it, right? It makes me think of the next decade, how far along it will be by 2035.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the show. I'm your host, Rob Wallace, and today I'm very grateful to be joined by Hewie Rattray, the CEO of the London Bitcoin Company, the only Bitcoin Treasury company listed on the London Stock Exchange. Hewie, how are you doing today?
I'm good, thanks, Rob. How are you?
Good. Yes, excited to have you here. We are in go time. Bitcoin Treasury companies are popping up all over the globe, and you guys are in the United Kingdom, which I think is a very special jurisdiction to be within for this time period. So before we get into all that, let's go into your history. You say that 2013, you were in university and you got addicted to the crypto space. Can you explain to us your first foray into Bitcoin?
Yeah, so we found out about Bitcoin, just throughout the course of, I think it was more towards the end of 2012 that we discovered it. And I think we'd read an article about the Silk Road. And, that's probably how a lot of people found out about Bitcoin as an asset class. And then, we started digging into it and we started looking through it, me and my friends, and we thought it was really interesting. And, I wish we had the foresight back then to say, let's just buy as much of this as we can at $17 and sit on it. But, we were 21-year-olds and we didn't really have that kind of time horizon that we'd stock up on something that would materialize in 20 years time or something like that. So we traded around it and we got quite into the space, and naturally we got quite into the shitcoins after Bitcoin, and the forks and the first forks like Stellar and Litecoin and stuff like that. And we just thought the whole thing was just crazy, and this whole new asset class, and it was anti-finance, it was almost anti-government, and it was the whole cyberpunk kind of movement, right? And yeah, it just attracted us, and we just had a lot of fun with it. And after that, I went into finance. Had to get a real job, and worked as a stockbroker for a couple of years. And then it was only that 2 years until I got sucked back into crypto. And then I worked for a small corporate finance house, and that was kind of basically trying to bridge the intersection between crypto and capital markets, or Bitcoin and crypto and capital markets. And we did a whole bunch of different stuff. And, we seeded and floated a big miner on the London Stock Exchange that ended up going to NASDAQ. We did a kind of enterprise blockchain project, which was doing energy trading on the blockchain. That was the buzz back. If you remember back in 2017, it was like, how can the blockchain disrupt industries, right? It wasn't necessarily all focused around Bitcoin. Beyond that, we kind of had a good few years doing that. And then I had a venture capital fund in Singapore, ran that for 3 years, got some really good exits on stuff, and then came back to London and then joined the London Bitcoin Company, and it's kind of been onwards and upwards since then.
Wonderful. Yes. So you are steeped in the tradition of finance in London. Can you explain for us, what is it like these days? Is London, would you still consider it a premier financial capital of the world? And how is the scene? What does it feel like working in this space?
Yeah. So London's a funny one, because in recent years, the London Stock Exchange hasn't been a great performer. It hasn't managed to get in the big tech IPOs. It's lost a lot of ground against NASDAQ and, to be honest, other global markets. So, London's always quite an interesting financial center in the way that the stock exchange seems to have a good decade, then a bad decade. But what is forever evident in London and forever consistent in London is the amount of money in the within the institutions that are kind of either domiciled or have office presence in London. London has the second biggest AUM in the world behind New York, right? So there's serious money here. London has 2 or 3 times the AUM of the other major G7 capital cities, right? The only people that were behind is the US itself. So when you look at London as an opportunity like that, how much money collectively is there in the city that invests, then, London's still a very vibrant financial center. But I think, everybody knows London's very behind in crypto, always has been in crypto and Bitcoin. We don't have any ETFs, we don't have any ETNs right now. The amount of investment deployed is nothing like what you guys have deployed in the States. We're just always a bit behind, and I think institutions will catch up here in time. And, maybe we need some ETF legitimacy to come in the second half of this year before they really decide that, this is a place that they want to play. But, to some extent, we are constrained by the regulator here. It doesn't always have a favorable view towards Bitcoin and digital assets. So, yeah, that's a kind of summary of London and how we are right now. But, I'm always bullish London, and I love London as a city. So, I have to stay loyal and stay here and try and do what we can.
Yeah. And would you say that Europe still looks to London as a leader in terms of finance and what to do next in markets?
Yeah, I mean, I think Europe's absolutely dwarfed by London and always will be, right? Like, London is a mega city. People don't realize, the amount that London itself contributes to the British GDP, right? It's one of those cities that everything is focused on. And, there's so much that comes out of the London capital markets. And like I said, there's such a big finance industry here. So yeah, when people think of Europe, even though we're not in the EU, you should think of London primarily as the place where business happens.
And now you are running the London Bitcoin company. But before it was called that, it was called Binance, and you had a different focus. It was mining. So tell us about the start of Binance and the business model before you became London Bitcoin company.
Yeah, so Binance started in 2023, and it started its journey as a miner. And, we had this kind of dynamic/hybrid mining operation in North America, in that, we wouldn't host our own machinery. We'd use hosting providers. We'd use people to source equipment for us. We'd pretty much outsource everything and just take, the very top line of everything. And, we had a successful kind of year and a half doing that. And I think, with the Bitcoin market, you've got to, and especially when you're in the capital markets, you've got to do something that not follows the trend, but something that your investors want to see. And I think, even towards the end of last year, we were thinking, if we have plans to go to NASDAQ, like, what's the mining competition like out there? There's huge miners out there, Marathon and Riot, right? That are almost unobtainable, when you're looking to kind of scalp the cost of production of a Bitcoin and, the energy that they get, the energy prices that they get. So we were kind of doing our prospectus for our LSE IPO, and we were discussing the alternatives. And, we liked this, the whole MicroStrategy and MetaPlanet was, starting to boom quite aggressively then. So we made sure to put in our prospectus, almost as a defense mechanism, that, whilst we can buy mining equipment with capital we raise, we also want to have the ability to buy Bitcoin and buy Bitcoin related assets. So related assets would be like other Treasury companies or ETFs or Bitcoin startups or whatever. And, luckily we did that, and it got approved by the regulator here. We did our IPO. Our lawyers told us, don't do anything too aggressive in the first couple of months, just wait. And, given you're the only Bitcoin operating company on the London Stock Exchange, maybe just, see how things go for a couple of months, see what the investor take up is. And then, and then a couple of months ago, we announced, that we were adopting a Treasury policy full time. We raised $4 million out of the States, and that was the kind of end of that. And we just got going from there. Since then, speaking in dollar terms, we've probably raised 5 million in the past week. About 3 weeks ago, we raised another 5 million. So, we've raised upwards of $12 million, I think, over the past month and a half, and in the process of deploying it into Bitcoin.
Yeah, mining is one of the most competitive industries in the world, and we're seeing them pivot a lot, right? There's many of these miners that are going into AI. Was that ever a consideration for you guys before you got into the Bitcoin Treasury?
Because we didn't own any of the data centers, we did have offers from, it's a weird situation last year when there was this AI gold rush. Like, we kept getting, because we were locked into hosting agreements for like 2 years or 3 years or whatever. And basically, the demand for AI compute became so much at one stage last year that our hosting providers would email us and, they'd say, we've got some Max 7 fan company or whatever that wants to buy all your slots. And, they'll pay you double what you're paying us, kind of thing. And we were like, well, it's quite tempting. But no, we had to stick with the business, right? And yeah, I mean, I think that demand has slightly died down a bit. There was just a bottleneck for a period of time in the US, but and now more infrastructure is being built, so these guys can all host stuff. But when it was at that time when they were all building a large language model after OpenAI came out, ChatGPT came out, and there just wasn't the rack space in the entirety of North America, so they were bidding quite high. And funnily enough, that's when most of the pivoting happened to AI compute with the miners. And I don't think, I mean, I'm not aware of anyone pivoting recently, but I don't think, the prospect is quite as good now. I think, people realize that, I like to hope miners realize that Bitcoin's going one way. So every coin you mine today, whether it be 80,000 or 70,000 or 100,000, you're going to make money on it if you hodl it for the next year.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's great that you guys gave yourselves that optionality, right? And you're sort of riding the markets and you're doing it really just in time, right? You guys found a great entry point, and it all aligned with you guys changing the name from Binance to the London Bitcoin Company, as well as having the ticker BTC.L, right?
Yeah.
So talk to us about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's the greatest ticker in the world, BTC on the London Stock Exchange, right? Like, you can't beat that. Yeah, we just, it's kind of annoying in the way that it's difficult to cash tag on Twitter, on X rather, because you just get a load of posts about Bitcoin, right? So we're going to try and find a workaround for that, i.e. maybe like our own kind of cash tag, LDM BTC or something like that. But yeah, I mean, we're glad to have this. And, it's a valuable commodity in itself. I think 10, 20 years time, when the Bitcoin runs out and the price goes to seven figures and beyond, everybody's going to want that ticker, right? And I'm going to hold on to it for my dear life for as long as I possibly can, and really time it on potentially selling it to someone or something. It's like it's like the modern day domain name. Like, it's like, sex.com, whatever that went for, like some insane amount of millions, right? Maybe one day we'll sell our ticker for more than our company.
Who knows, right? But it's definitely a differentiator. And in this market, that's what it's about, right? You need to set yourself apart from the other competition. And so let's take a look at the UK Bitcoin Treasury scene. Smarter Web really exploded earlier this year. And now I think there are some other competitors popping up as well. So give us a 30,000 foot view of what it looks like in terms of competition.
Yeah, I mean, essentially, there's a very vibrant treasury industry, and it's for a bunch of reasons in the UK, right? There's no ETF is number one, right? So, there's all this money that's mandated to only invest on the stock market. Some of it's just got a London Stock Exchange mandate. Some of it's got, general capital markets in London or in the UK mandate. Now, they have no way to have any exposure to Bitcoin, right? There's just no alternative to them. So when these treasury stocks start to pop up, there's obviously immediate interest from these institutions. And then on the flip side, retail have, just like you have in the States, we have these special tax-free investment wrappers. We have our pension pots, which we can opt to self-invest. And again, you can't go into Bitcoin itself with that money. You have to find a proxy. And these treasury companies are becoming that perfect proxy. So when you look at the money in London, when you look at the money specifically, for the London Stock Exchange, specifically for capital markets in general, and you look at the retail money in the tax efficient wrappers and in the pension pots, it's cumulatively a huge amount of money. It's trillions of dollars, right? And all those trillions of dollars have no access to Bitcoin. So there's definitely room and scope for even more to come in London, I think. And, as a Bitcoiner, I hope for more and more and more every day, right? I don't see them as competition, although, sometimes it frustrates me when someone's outperforming us or someone's buying better or raising more. But, ultimately we all have the same goal, and is to support Bitcoin and, to continue to kind of spread the word about Bitcoin and spread the word about adoption. So you have to look at it in like a non-combative way, I think, when another company announces, another company raises, and, maybe they get an investor that I wanted. And, I have to say, think of the mission here. I have to think of my shareholders, but I also have to think of, the obsession I've had over the past 12 years of my life, right? And how good this is all happening for it. But yeah, Smarter Web, such a well executed IPO, like incredibly done. And, they've got the big support of the UCXO, 210K Capital guys, Tyler and David, who, are good guys. And the more I'm getting to know them, the more I'm really appreciating everything that they're doing in the industry. And then, you have a bunch of the smaller plays, us amongst them. We're going for a different pool of capital. We're going for the London Stock Exchange funds and pension funds and stuff like that. So, I just think that there's definitely scope for more and more and more to pop up over here.
Yeah. Speaking of David Bailey and Nakamoto, you were just in Vegas a couple of weeks ago, and really the big theme of that whole conference was Bitcoin Treasury companies. Tell us about your experience coming to America, speaking to investors, and what was the reception like for London Bitcoin Company?
Can I just say I'm so annoyed that it was in Vegas because it's so distracting, that place, and it's like you're trying to make your way to the conference, and you're like, oh, maybe just one-handed blackjack, and then next thing you know, you're late. But no, I'm just kidding. But yeah, it was a great conference, right? And wow, I've been to the Bitcoin conference before, in Miami way back, and in Nashville last year and stuff like that, and this was just another level, right? Like it was crazy this year around. It basically, in terms of most conferences I go to, this was the most impressive one, given that it's for an asset where there really wasn't much interest 10 years ago. Back in 2016, I ran an event in London, and it was called the City of London Bitcoin Investors Meetup. And it was like, this was all part of our bringing Bitcoin to the capital markets kind of theme. And, I'd get like 25, 30 people at that event. And that was impressive numbers at those times. Like other Bitcoiners were coming who were running other meetups in other parts of London. They're like, I can't believe you're getting 50 people at this event. We get like 10 at ours. There was just no interest. But yeah, I mean, I was happy at that point to be spreading the word. And, David is doing such a great job, and Tyler are doing such a great job with the Bitcoin conference these days. I think it's great that Treasuries were the kind of flavor of the month, because I think the press is only good for everyone involved. And I think, most Bitcoiners, with the exception of maybe a small portion, are very supportive of the Treasury play on the capital markets and how good it is for Bitcoin and how good it is for adoption. So yeah, I think, it was a great conference, and it was a great few days.
So let's take a moment to address those doubters, the critics, the haters of the Bitcoin treasury companies. I think overall, Bitcoin has ahead of it the path to become the world's neutral reserve currency, right? And if that's the case, banks are going to adopt it, nation states are going to adopt it. This is just sort of natural par for the course. But of course, there are Bitcoiners out there who say, no, we need to keep to our libertarian cypherpunk roots. This is not the way it should be unfolding. What do you have to say to those people on X?
It's difficult, because part of me still believes that too, as much as I'd be in an incredibly hypocritical position. But you can't have this attitude where this is my thing and you can't use it, because that's anti-libertarian, right? It's not within the thesis of the entire movement to say you're an investment bank or you're a government, so you shouldn't hold Bitcoin. Like, I think some people see the treasury industry as like a grift. I've even read on Twitter, and they refer to some treasury CEOs as moon boys, or whatever people get called in crypto when they're kind of chasing trends and hype. But, I think whenever you move into Bitcoin, or whenever you move into treasuries, or whenever you move into something that has some sentiment behind it, like, I think as long as you're doing it for the right reasons, there shouldn't be an issue with it at all. And, we can't hide from the fact that there's hugely positive sentiment around treasury companies this year, right? Like, it's happening. And the more people that come from, the deeper depths of crypto, or come from other areas in Bitcoin, and they come and do a treasury company, launch a treasury company, and make the sole mission of that company to buy and hold Bitcoin, I don't see how anyone can really give a good counter argument to why that's not a good thing. Like, you tell me that 10 years ago that there's a dozen public companies on the public markets in the UK, and they're all buying Bitcoin as aggressively as they can, and they're all raising money as aggressively as they can to buy more Bitcoin, I would have just not believed you flat out. I would have said, there's no way we get to that point, but here we are. And that just shows you, how this asset class, how Bitcoin is probably more special than anyone thought it would be back then. And, it makes me think of the next decade. Where's it going to be in 10 more years' time, right? Given, when I'm looking through that lens from back then, I just wonder how far along it will be by 2035, right? Like, and it's got to be, yeah, the reserve currency of the entire world, right? Like, that's the next big step that is going to take. And, I fully believe, given how much it's evolved in the past 10 years, that that's going to happen in the next 10 years.
I wanted to briefly interrupt today's interview to give a big shout out to our lead sponsor, Rhino Bitcoin. Rhino is the all-in-one Bitcoin super app built by Bitcoiners for Bitcoiners. Buy or sell instantly. Send sats anywhere on the Lightning Network. Withdraw straight to cold storage. Even turn sats into gift cards or link to a Casa multisig, all within one sleek interface. And Rhino is just warming up. Soon, you'll pay bills, borrow against your Bitcoin, and save for retirement, all without leaving the app. Download Rhino at rhinobitcoin.com or tap the link in the description below. Use promo code Bitcoin News and Rhino will drop you $10 of free Bitcoin into your account today. Secure your stack with Rhino Bitcoin and enjoy the rest of the video. I would say one of the biggest fears amongst Bitcoiners over on X is that these companies are paper-handed, that come the next bear market, a downturn, they'll be the first ones to sell and put a bad taste in people's mouths about another 80% drawdown in Bitcoin. So do you think that is a possible fear to look out for? And B, how would London Bitcoin Company withstand a 75% drawdown in the price of Bitcoin?
Okay, so on the first part of that question, the people who say that they have to give an alternative buyer, right? They have to say, if these guys are paper hands and they're bad for Bitcoin, there has to be someone else who would be buying the Bitcoin that we're buying. And, is there any reason for you to believe some anonymous on-chain address is diamond-handed, not paper-handed? No, like, it's just impossible for you to know. Everything that the Treasury companies are doing buying Bitcoin is probably the best outcome. Even if some do capitulate, when if we go into another bear market, I don't really mind, as long as if someone's buying Bitcoin and they're holding it for a week, if they're buying Bitcoin and holding it for a month, if they're buying Bitcoin and holding it for a decade, it doesn't make a difference to me. It's just more adoption, right? And you can't expect 100% of Bitcoin buying on a monthly, annual basis or whatever to be diamond-handed 10-year time horizon buying or 100-year time horizon buying. It's just unrealistic. And then onto your point about there being some capitulation, if there is a 75% drawdown in the price, yeah, I'm sure there will be with some companies. Like Tesla did it in the last bear market, right? And, Tesla didn't arguably need to do it at all. They got scared and they made a board decision to sell it. They had plenty of cash reserves at the time. It was kind of bizarre when you look back at it like that. But I think, for a small company like ours, it really depends on the level we get to, at certain points in the cycle. And there has to be a bit of intuition. It's not, and, I have to say this very carefully because it's probably going to be an unpopular line for some people, but it's probably sensible at some point for us to put some kind of hedge on for the benefit of our shareholders, right? It's probably sensible for us, it doesn't cost a lot to hedge $100 million stack, right? You can buy put options, you can buy long dated stuff, that's very inexpensive, that only comes into action in a worst case scenario. And I think, Saylor doesn't need to hedge because he's a multi-billion-dollar company on the NASDAQ and he'll always have access to capital. But for us, a hedging strategy comes into play, as we go up in certain tiers. And, we have to remember that I'm not playing with my own stack here, right? Like I have thousands of shareholders that I'm responsible for underneath me. And as much as I don't think, in my heart of hearts, I don't think hedging is necessary because I think if we just hold and survive, we'll keep going up. I know that if I put a good hedge in place when Bitcoin gets to 200, 250, then it would actually afford me to be able to buy bigger in the bear market if there is a bear market and get much better entry for my long-term shareholders. So yeah, it's something that probably someone will clip record that or screenshot that and they'll say, wow, this guy's a bear, or this guy's talking about shorting Bitcoin with put options. And it's not like that. I'll always be heavily weighted towards being long, but I have to look after my investors and I have to make sure, even in 2 years time, maybe for whatever reason I'm no longer in this position and I want whoever my successor is to feel comfortable that there's some strategy in place for a kind of worst case scenario drawdown.
Yeah, and I do think that your experience in the options markets is sort of one of Bitcoin company's secret superpower that
Yeah.
I've heard a few other CEOs talk about, and we'll touch on that later. But first, I want to talk about your team. You're the CEO, you're the head of the show, but I've heard you say that there are too many dinosaurs in this space, too much gray hair, and you want to bring some youth into this movement. And so, talk about how do you look at developing a team, being the leader, and what kind of ethos and company mentality do you want to have?
Yeah, I mean, I want to bring fresh faces in because probably the collective age of my board is like 260 or something like that. So, I feel like we need to bring the average down a bit. And, that's why I'm kind of racing around, speaking to, big young Bitcoiners and, young millennials or below kind of thing. And, I think a lot of the time when you want to get the message across to investors and to shareholders and stuff like that, it does something like Bitcoin, like such a disruptive young asset class, almost comes across better from a young person's mouth. And that's that to some might sound kind of strange because at the end of the day, wisdom comes with age, but a lot of the time spent over my past 10 years has been the smartest people I know in my family and who are friends of my family and stuff like that. Old dudes who are in finance telling me that Bitcoin's rat poison squared, or that's what Warren Buffett said. Jamie Dimons hated it, and now he's adopting it. Right? You have to understand that traditional market opinions don't really count for much in this space. Like, we're dealing with something completely new, and that's why life experience, doesn't necessarily apply to someone representing a Bitcoin or a Bitcoin treasury company.
Yeah, innovation comes from youth.
Yeah.
But another thing that comes from youth is hype and excitement. You said that you were in Japan and you got to taste the Metaplanet vibe firsthand.
Yeah.
So tell us about that experience and then how you want to do that for your company.
Yeah, it was crazy. Just after Vegas, I flew over to Tokyo because I had a bunch of stuff to do over there, um, and basically I was wearing a Metaplanet T-shirt that I'd bought in Vegas, and I wore it a couple of days, and I was being stopped the whole time by people, and they were pointing at the T-shirt and saying Metaplanet, and everyone was really excited about it. Then I went to a poker game. Everyone knew about it at the poker game, and everyone was showing me their portfolios with Metaplanet stock in it. Um, they've got this kind of viral effect over there. Like, I can't remember the stats off the top of my head, but they've got some insane penetration. When it comes to Tokyo Stock Exchange metrics, like the amount of shareholders, the amount of buys per day and trades per day, and social posts and stuff like that. Like Simon Garbage posts about this stuff a lot because they've got mind share and they've got hype, right? In Japan, and that's something that's actually really rare. And it's amazing that they've managed to do this. And Japan's unique in itself in that digital assets have really heavy tax treatments, and really I don't know the depths of it, but I know enough to know that holding Bitcoin is tricky, and there's a number of reasons why it's better to hold a treasury company in Japan. Even though my best advice would be to always hold Bitcoin first and foremost, but just reflecting why Metaplanet has done so well over the past year, there is some kind of um, economic reasons for that. With what we're doing, the first part of my kind of plan was the name change, like make something really relevant and make something that people want to associate themselves with, and make something that sounds so official and sounds so proper that investors are happy to part with their cash. Like, I think it's important to realize, the competition around the space is like a beauty parade, right? And so whoever presents themselves in the best way possible is going to capture a lot of that investor mindshare. And yeah, I mean, we're not at the stage where we're memeing it aggressively yet. I think, we've got to get to a certain level of performance before we start doing that. But I think, once we break through and break out from potentially the other treasury companies and we, have some great sentiment behind the stock and the stock's trading up and, everyone's doing well off it, then that's when you start hitting it with like trying to get that kind of viral sensation around it. And that's when you start really aggressively doing fun stuff with the name and the brand and stuff like that. So yeah, we're waiting for that moment, and I'm fully prepared to pounce on it when it comes.
It seems as if the overall strategy for a Bitcoin treasury company is to get that retail hype, that drive going in the beginning, and then that can then entice institutional investors to come on board. in terms of building that audience, that hype, what is the appetite for people in their 30s, in their 20s in the UK for Bitcoin? Is it understood by the younger investors, and is there adoption?
It's funny because, over the years, like some people in the UK have referred to Bitcoin as boomer crypto, right? And now they're now everyone's having to suck it up and eat their words and realize that this is where the real value was all the time, right? And, that's including myself. Like, I've been honest and all the way through this that, I've definitely been sucked into other parts of crypto. And, I'm not completely disgraced as a result of it. Like, because I'm here and I'm back and I swallowed my pride and I said, ultimately Bitcoin's the best. The demographic for Bitcoin and crypto in general here is, it's definitely between the ages of 25 to 35. There's some huge activity in this space. There's good venture capitalists out here, who deploy a lot in the Bitcoin space. There's great protocols that happen around digital assets. Not to shill other chains, but like Pump Fun is a UK company, right, and is done incredibly well in its own right in terms of revenue and stuff like that. If people like it or not, that's a different thing. But there's generally a lot of entrepreneurial energy in crypto across all sectors, across in the UK, across AI and Bitcoin and digital assets and neobanking and fintech and stuff like that. We do have that drive as a nation, definitely. And there's lots of favorable government legislation around startups and stuff like that. So I think the next generation, the Zoomers or Generation Alpha, I think my feelings are knowing a lot of them. I think a lot of these guys and girls are going to come and build on Bitcoin. And, I'm glad that we're having this huge run, and I'm glad the dominance is up because we're getting so much talent come back to Bitcoin now.
Yeah, and it's funny that now we're at this point where the Bitcoin treasury companies have done so well. We're seeing some companies such as Bit Digital make the pivot to go from Bitcoin miner and ETH staker to just straight ETH treasury company, right? And I've heard you say that Bitcoin is the only asset in terms of digital assets that's proper for a treasury. So if you had to make the defense of Bitcoin as the only digital asset proper for a treasury company, how would you do so?
I mean, the very obvious one is there's a finite supply, right? ETH has emissions, and the tokenomics don't really stack up for what you'd have as a treasury company. But I think people like Tom Lee in the States and stuff like that would argue against that. Everyone's over the years has used currency as treasury, right? Traditional fiat currency for whatever it's worth. They've used it as a treasury asset. So I think Bitcoin makes the most sense, but I think there can be subjective opinions about other asset classes or other tokens or whatever making sense for someone in their treasury. But I would only ever invest it in Bitcoin as a treasury asset for us. That's where I see the most upside, and that's where I see the least downside. I think things like Ethereum, they don't rely on the same things as Bitcoin to be successful. Ethereum is a decentralized application chain, right? They have KPIs that they have to meet for it to be successful, right? People need to be building a huge amount of stuff on ETH, and people need to, there needs to be transaction throughput happening, for ETH to make sense as a product, right? Bitcoin doesn't have all these needs and requirements to be a success, right? In the same way that gold doesn't need to have any enterprise value to back up its real value, gold and silver, right? As well as, silver's used in the iPhones or silver's used for jewelry. It's purely the fact, of them as precious metals, gold and silver, that gives them their value, right? It's not the underlying economic use case of them or anything like that. And that's the same for Bitcoin. There doesn't have to be underlying economic use case really for Bitcoin. Its most prominent use case is its store of value and its scarcity. And I think that's important for people to remember when they're thinking about investing in other treasury companies. They say to themselves, is this a treasury asset, or is this asset going to go up and down based on some other KPIs? And the situation with ETH and Solana and other altcoins or whatever you want to call them, that is the situation with them. Like, their price isn't just going to go up based on them being a store of value, because that's not what they were built for. That's not what they were founded for. And yeah, there's going to be other things that make them vulnerable.
Let's go into your Bitcoin acquisition strategy. You're the boss man. You have experience with options markets, and Strategy has laid out this whole new playbook with preferred stocks and convertible debt. Tell us about the Bitcoin acquisition plans for London Bitcoin Company.
Yeah, when we raise money, we typically don't have like an attitude to DCA. Like I always mostly, as soon as we get access to capital, I will almost always immediately buy Bitcoin, right? And I think that's what I would recommend most companies to do. Don't worry about getting top ticked. Don't worry about there being a 5% pullback, because one day we'll wake up and it will be 20, 30, 40% up. And then the next day it will be another 20% up. And, anyone who's implementing a DCA strategy will just immediately regret their decision at that point, right? In terms of other structures, like what I'm quite far down the road on now is definitely looking at the debt markets as a non-dilutive way to grow us, right? I want to issue bonds that are secured by Bitcoin, give the bondholder a call option on the stock and perhaps pad them in some kind of yield somewhere, depending on the appetite, and scale ourselves up that way. And that gives us a nice bit of leverage. It means we're not immediately diluted, and the kind of the weight on the share price can have a little bit of a break, and we can still build our stack. Outside of that, doing traditional Bitcoin backed loans, lending your Bitcoin to someone, using your Bitcoin as collateral just to get a straight loan from someone, 50, 60% LTV or something, a point where we feel safe, is a very productive way to increase exposure in Treasury. And then, yeah, like you say, utilizing the options markets, right? There's a ton of different strategies, covered calls or selling puts, where you can earn a premium, or you can ride some upside, with a little bit of leverage, which isn't costing you a whole lot. It really, I speak to a lot of people, some of them who you've been helpful in introducing, about Bitcoin strategy. And, I really want to have that strategist on our team. And I think more importantly than simply a Bitcoin strategist, I want a strategist around making financial instruments that make sense for us at various stages in our life cycle, right? And, Saylor obviously has a team of 100 investment bankers designing his products for him, right? And, you have the luxury of that when you're worth $100 billion. We don't quite have that money to deploy on that kind of team. So, we have to be quite entrepreneurial. And, I think if we're looking for mindshare, we have to be inventive with the products that we do. They have to make sense, and they have to be secure, and they have to be a decent move for us. But at the same time, I want to be innovative. I want to be the first in the UK to do this and this and this, right? Like, I don't just want to copy exactly what Saylor's done. I mean, most of those products that he's launched wouldn't make sense for a company of our size anyway. So yeah, that's, looking at Saylor's playbook right now, that's a bit further down the line. It's arguable if we can, if it really does make sense here in the UK. We don't have many companies which have all these different share alternatives over here. But yeah, I mean, I like to look at meta-planet structures, and I like the blockchain group structures. I like the Bitcoin-denominated bonds and things like that. I think they're really interesting.
Yeah, explain for the viewers the Bitcoin-denominated bond strategy.
Yeah, so you essentially find a Bitcoin holder, who's got a big stack of Bitcoin, and you actually denominate or value the bond in Bitcoin. So he'll buy X Bitcoin worth of your bond, say 10 Bitcoin worth. That Bitcoin goes into your treasury. This investor would usually get a conversion price on top, as a little sweetener. So he'd maybe get a conversion price at 20% above your share price today. The bond term is like 2 years. And theoretically, if it comes to the end of those 2 years and your share price hasn't gone above the conversion price, the Bitcoin whale would just get his Bitcoin back, right? So the bond is Bitcoin denominated rather than US dollar denominated. That's the important thing to remember in a transaction like that. So he would theoretically still enjoy the upside on his Bitcoin, which is important for these Bitcoin holders and getting them to put their Bitcoin into our treasuries, right?
Mm-hmm. And have you had any discussions with Bitcoin whales? And
yeah.
what is...
The feedback's always good. And, I just, the luxury of being in the space for such a long time is you just know people, right? And, you know people who have gone from, being completely broke to being, huge Bitcoin whales over the years, right? And, people have made very much the right moves and got to certain points. So, mostly with the Bitcoin denominated bond, we're trying to do something like that over here, but it's like, the FCA are already quite hostile towards the space in general. So convincing our lawyers, to structure something or help us structure something, and then, basically run it past, various advisors and regulatory consultants and say, can we do this? without being thrown out the door is a bit of a process, right? Like, you gotta get something that's airtight together. But yeah, there's definitely appetite in this country. Like, you asked the question of what's the general vibe over here when it comes to Bitcoin. There's a lot of rich Bitcoiners over here. There's a lot of well-known Bitcoiners who live in London and around, the kind of local area.
And there's, of course, a lot of institutional investors in London, and you come to them with this whole entire different set of lingo, right? We've got MNAV, BTC yield, months to cover. Is it like explaining an alien subject to them, or do they pick up on all this stuff very quickly?
I mean, it depends if they got their quant or analyst in the room, right? Like usually the fund managers don't really look at that kind of stuff. But you can break days to cover and months to cover, and even MNAV. If you speak slowly and almost write it down on paper for them, they begin to understand, and that's why it's good. That's why it's quite useful not being the very first in the market, right? Because you can actually, if you look at something like MetaPlanet or even MicroStrategy back in the days, you can actually see the theory in practice, right? Someone said to me, this days to an investor I was seeing the other day, he's a fund manager in London. He was saying this days to cover and months to cover and MNAV is just all made up stuff to justify valuations, right? And I said, no. And, I brought up the MicroStrategy chart and I brought up the MetaPlanet chart. And I said, look, this was their MNAV at that point. This is where they raised money. This is where they compressed their MNAV. And this is where they got rewarded for the market for doing that. And then this is where they raised again and effectively backfilled their premium, backfilled premium. And, he did actually say, wow, it's quite interesting now that you've shown me it actually happen in practice, right? He didn't believe it when I didn't cite an example of it working. But as soon as I showed him an example of where it has worked so effectively in 12 months with MetaPlanet, he kind of got it in that way. So you've actually got to refer to not that I look at them as competition, but you have to refer to your peer group. And, the proof is in the pudding, as we say in this country, right? And then they start to believe you.
And you've described this era as an arms race, right? You're all trying to get as much Bitcoin as quickly as possible, but you also say that you're all on the same team. So for you as a CEO, what's it like? Is it leading a Bitcoin treasury company? Are you sleeping at all? Do you keep your eye on the price of Bitcoin constantly? What is it like for you day to day right now at this pivotal time?
I only actually sleep like 4 hours a night, and I always have done for like, I don't know, for the past 10, 15 years. So I don't sleep any less than I usually sleep anyway. But I have more to do now, which is great because, I kind of had some time off before doing this and, was kind of relaxing and just, enjoying last year's post bull market, loot and then kind of come into this job and it's super hard. And, you kind of have to do a bit of everything, right? You have to do lots of PR. I wasn't very used to being in front of the camera before this. And, now I've done more interviews than, I've done cumulatively in the rest of my life before this job. And, I think, there's a lot of hard decisions to make, which I've had to do recently over the past week or two. And, you have to think about what's good for your long-term shareholders. And you have to make unpopular decisions today that are, I'm certain will end up to be good decisions, as time goes on and things unravel. And it's difficult, dealing with not dealing with shareholders, but like understanding shareholders and understanding the volatility and trying to relate to them, when they're up and down and when the market has a bad day. Like that's probably the most difficult part about being in a position like mine is knowing that the impact of your decisions can seriously affect people, right? And, I don't ever recommend people, buy way too much of a stock or over leverage themselves on a stock, especially in a crazy volatile industry like we're in right now. But, you kind of have to live with the consequences of your decision making and you have to believe in what you're doing and that it's right. And, as long as you act with honesty and transparency, I believe that ultimately we will be rewarded for just buying and stacking Bitcoin and sitting on it, right? I don't think I can really go that wrong, when that's the main thesis. So yeah, it's interesting. It's like a whole mix of emotions, right? And it's like a lot of stuff that I'm not used to, a lot of stuff that I really enjoy, and a lot of stuff that tugs at my heartstrings a bit, along the way. So yeah, I'm enjoying it a lot though.
Yeah, and a big part of this, of course, is communication. As you said, being open, being transparent, and you are doing a lot of interviews. You're getting yourself out there in the media. But are you talking to shareholders directly? Do you have groups in order and lines of
Yeah.
communication with them?
Yeah, we have a Telegram channel that I definitely drop into and speak to our shareholders. I try to keep a close relationship as possible with them, without breaching rules and regulations and stuff like that. Like, I think, being a holder of various stocks throughout my life, right? Like, the common theme is almost always a lack of communication. Very rarely do management communicate well with shareholders. And that was kind of top of my list of stuff that I wanted to do, going into this role is get a good relationship going with my shareholders, understanding that they're not going to love me every day and they're not going to be happy with my decisions every day. But, hopefully the ones that stick with me, I'm sure of it, are going to be happy that they did by the end, by the end of the year or the end of next year or whatever.
You're the dad of the London Bitcoin Company. You're going to make decisions that might not always be well liked, but are for the good of the shareholders in the long run. Yes. So a big part of your roadmap coming up is the dual listing on the NASDAQ. Is that possible? How realistic is that? And what's the timeline?
Yeah, it's entirely possible. Especially at our size right now, NASDAQ regulations, they require a minimum fundraising free float, which shouldn't be a problem for us. There's definitely appetite for the London Bitcoin Company in New York. We've had a bunch of calls, and we continue to have calls. We're working with our banker, who's called Dominari. They were a big book runner on or placing agent on the American Bitcoin deal, which was Eric Trump's, I think. And yeah, they have a very close relationship, with a lot of the big kind of Bitcoin backing investors and banks in the space. So yeah, we're full speed ahead. I'm very sure that I want to be the first Bitcoin Treasury company with 2 tier 1 listings globally. And, it might be that Metaplanet beat me to it. I don't really know what's going on with their American listing plans, but I know that Simon is always brags about the fact that his stock is traded 19 hours a day, which is kind of cool because he's listed in Japan, Frankfurt, and the OTC, right? So he has a really nice spread of time zones there. I can't believe how he handles that as a CEO. Like CEO, he must wake up in the night and check his price, right? Like you don't have any time off. It's so crypto that, right? It's so like, for an asset that's traded 24 hours a day, it just makes sense to make your stock traded for as many hours of the day as possible. I thought, this is going to be quite nice working in the stock market because in the hours over here are 8 o'clock to 4:30. But my God, does it stretch beyond that? Like you don't get the time off. Someone's going to start opening their market. I think Frankfurt opened their market on a Sunday evening or something, but someone's going to start opening their stock market at the weekend, and then we're all going to hate them, but also love them for it.
Yeah. So now let's look ahead. What's the biggest challenge? Is there anything that you see that could derail this experiment for all these treasury companies across the planet?
It's a good question because I often think having so much PTSD from previous cycles, always in the back of my mind is what's it going to be this time around? And I think those of us who've been in Bitcoin for a long time, we've got so used to it. And I'm not saying that I expect it to happen or I expect there to be some huge black swan event that's going to tank the whole industry. But, it is kind of in the back of my mind. And that's why, it's important that we talked about hedging strategies and stuff like that. I just think there's just so much support on the upside right now that it's very difficult to see like a cataclysmic event that would take us back down to like 20 or 30K per Bitcoin, right? It's very difficult to see who has that influence in the market. For me, it would have to be a macroeconomic event, right? It would have to be, a banking crisis of some huge degree. And, we have to understand as well as we want Bitcoin to be a contrarian asset, a lot of the investors and a lot of the holders still see it as a risk asset. And it still would be, alongside NASDAQ stocks or whatever, it still would be one of the first things they liquidate if they're worried about their finances. And I know that doesn't make sense, when we think about, the hyperinflation of the US dollar and stuff like that. But, getting investors into Bitcoin is one thing, but changing their mind on it being a risky and volatile asset is another mission that we've got to work on for the next 5-10 years. And, volatility is already shrinking a lot. Like, during the tariff wars, Bitcoin moved no more either side than the NASDAQ did, right? So that's an achievement in itself, right? Like we're not the most volatile asset anymore, like we have been historically, right? And the more people see it as, I mean, it's going to take some time for Bitcoin to be an actual contrarian asset class, like gold, but we'll get there, I think.
Mm-hmm. And now let's paint the rosy picture. You're going to get thousands and thousands of Bitcoin over the next 3-4 years. And then how does London Bitcoin Company evolve? What's the step after that?
Yeah, this is a question I get a lot, and it's almost embarrassing that I don't have a concrete plan in place, for when we get to that level. I think there's many things you could do, and I don't want to tie myself to one specific concept or idea. Like, I think when we last spoke, I talked a lot about startups and development in the Bitcoin space. I'd love for the London Bitcoin Company to help London-based Bitcoin companies and developers to kind of launch and incubate projects and stuff like that. Almost act like an accelerator or kind of Bitcoin Y-Com or something like that. And I think that would be a fundamentally important mission to the UK and to the Bitcoin space in general, right? And I think if we can use our Bitcoin to help other Bitcoin companies, grow the Bitcoin network and develop products on the Bitcoin network, like I think that's a really good mission to have in mind. And then, there is alternative strategies that people can implement. You could almost use your Bitcoin to kind of launch a kind of merchant bank. Like I think there was the news about MetaPlanet doing something along those lines. And then you can borrow against it and do all sorts of stuff, right? But I think, if I was to look at ourselves in 3 years time, when we're sitting on 10, $20 billion of Bitcoin, I'd definitely be, either learning it or using it as equity investment into startups, in the Bitcoin space, who are doing great things on Bitcoin and helping grow them. And especially in the UK space, right? Like we've got a lot of education to do around London, and there's a hell of a lot of good we could do with that kind of stack.
Yeah, it's in your name. It's your mission to raise up the whole entire London Bitcoin scene.
Yeah.
Wonderful, Hewie. Well, thank you so much for your time. If people want to learn more about London Bitcoin Company, follow you on social media, where should they go?
Yeah, mainly my X is where I'm probably most active, which is at Hewie BTC. So yeah, follow me there, put me a message, and we can take it from there.
Cheers, Hewie. All right, I'll let you get
Cheers,
back
Rob.
to the job.
Thank you, mate. Thank you.